Today's episode of Mile 40 is brought to you by HelloFresh. In the midst of fatherhood, marathon training, writing, and building the Mile 40 community, I tend to be forgetful of feeding myself. And that's why I lean on America's #1 meal kit. A crazy schedule can make it easy to fall back into your dinner time recipe rut. Keep mealtime exciting with over 40 recipes to choose from weekly. So there's always something delicious to discover with HelloFresh. With so many in-season ingredients, you'll taste all the freshness of fall in every bite of HelloFresh's chef-crafted recipes. Produce travels from the farm to your door for peak ripeness that you can taste. Now, go to HelloFresh.com/50Mile40Pod and use code 50Mile40Pod for 50% off plus free shipping. Once again, go to HelloFresh.com/50Mile40Pod and use code 50Mile40Pod for 50% off plus free shipping. We'll add the link to the show notes of today's episode for you to check out HelloFresh today. Welcome back to another episode of the Mile 40 podcast. Excited to have you all here today. Today's guest is one that I am just laughing thinking about the fact that I got him on board. And the reason I say that is because, Giulio, spoiler, I can't listen to your podcast while running or working out because I can't tell you the amount of times I almost dropped a weight or tripped over myself running, listening to your show.
You dog.
Yeah, man. For the audience out there, Giulio Gallarotti is a New York City-based stand-up comedian, actor, host, and podcaster. He made his Netflix stand-up comedy special debut on Pete Davidson Presents The Best Friends in June 2022. His podcast, Oops, is regularly listed on the iTunes top charts. He has appeared on TV shows such as Hulu's Rami and MTV's Totally Clueless Girl Code, as well as appearances on Comedy Central and SiriusXM. Giulio is an avid traveler, which has been documented in several projects, including Places You Can Go, Afghanistan, and Iraq. We're going to dive into that. And stand up in Rwanda. It's not so different. On his most recent trip to Afghanistan, he started a school in a small town of a remote province that now employs 7 teachers and educates over 150 boys and girls. Giulio performs regularly at comedy clubs in New York City and across the country. Giulio, thank you for joining me, my man.
Dude, thank you, man. Thank you. What's going on?
I appreciate you for letting me slide in the DMs. I've been a big fan of Oops for the last year or so. And honestly, I mean, I wasn't kidding. The amount of times that I've almost dropped a weight on myself listening to you. And one of the things that really stands out about you is not only are you hilarious as a comedian, but as a person, you're as authentic as they come. And, one thing I forgot to mention, and I should mention for the audience here, is congrats on your recent engagement.
Thank you, dude. I appreciate that.
Of course.
Yeah.
So why don't we kick things off by understanding a little bit about your background? I know one of the things that you do on the show, which is awesome, is you've really brought in the people around you. Your fiance has been on the show a couple of times. Your pops is a regular on the show. And so let's just kind of dig into who Giulio was before he climbed to podcast fame.
Cool, dude. Man. I grew up predominantly in a pretty small town in Connecticut that was sort of like, it's not really suburban, not really like a sidewalk town. It's kind of like, I would call it more rural and not really influenced by any like neighboring city. So that was where I grew up mostly. I was here originally. My parents are both from Italy and they met in New York City. And then when I was born, I lived in Brooklyn when I was a little kid. And then we lived in Connecticut. My upbringing was pretty straightforward. Didn't really I'm trying to think about how to explain this. I didn't have access to different types of people. Now, I guess when you're a kid, you just don't. Yeah. But when I went to school in Boston. I went to Boston University. It was like a pretty awesome experience to meet people from who had different kind of upbringings, and that could have something to do with money, that could have something to do with culture, whatever it was. It was just sort of a nice mixture of people. And it was interesting to get to be this is how a wide variety of people live their lives. How do you want to live your life? You know what I mean? And I don't know that I can pinpoint specifically what the answer to that question was, but I took little bits and pieces of of things that I learned from people that I had met, and kind of like chose my path. One thing I remember really sticking out was access, like learning that people had access to certain things. I didn't realize that that was even possible. You know what I mean? Like people would tell me stories about how at a bar mitzvah, specifically this story at a bar mitzvah, Jay Sean, I don't know if you're familiar with Jay Sean. He sings the song, "Are you down, down, down?"
Yeah,
down,
absolutely.
like Jay Sean performed at the bar mitzvah. I was like, what? Like you can do that? You can hire famous people to like perform at your private events? Like I don't know. I remember like learning that like there were people who just had more access in life than I did growing up. And I was like, oh, I want access. I want like to be able to do the shit everybody else does or whatever. I don't know. Like, I don't know that how specifically that I can like pinpoint how that made any difference, but just, it's funny to remember aha moments where I was like, oh, other people can do this or that or whatever. So from there, I decided I wanted to live in New York because it was easy. It was close to Boston. It was close to Connecticut. It was close to like where some of my relatives lived in New York. So I was like, okay, whatever. I'll go there and I'll try to get a job. So I got a job working in a real estate company. So anyway, not to ramble on, but basically while I was doing that job, I sort of started messing around doing stand-up. I tried out doing a show, like a bringer show or whatever. We don't need to get into specifics of what that means. But like shows that you can just do if you have no experience, basically. Then some open mics. It went from one show a month to 2 shows a week. And then the job sort of wasn't working out. So I was like, all right, fuck it, quit the job. And then I started giving tennis lessons on the side. I used to play tennis. I left that out. I played juniors and I played in college as well. I was captain of my team, actually. And from there, yeah, just kept doing comedy and trying out a bunch of different stuff and having varying degrees of success over the years. And now here we are where we are. So that's it.
How would you describe yourself socially, right? Like, I mean, like, were you the funny man or were you kind of a lone wolf who thought he was really funny in his own head?
I think I was funny. I don't know if I was the funny man, but I was one of the funny men. I used to do like the commentary of the basketball games, for example. Like I would do all the broadcast sports and like I was an obvious choice for that. You know, and there were like little things about me that were like funny, and they may not even be specifically the things that my sense of humor has evolved into, but just like stupid shit. I used to make stupid faces. I used to do stupid voices, like not necessarily stupid, but whatever, like funny shit, right?
Yeah.
I guess I was like leaning toward a class clown type, and I was pretty social. I would say I had like a good amount of friends. I was like typically in the circles of people who were like active socially and stuff. So, yeah.
Well, what I love about that route and where it kind of reconciles with Oops and the podcast is both those routes aren't routes where success is handed to you, right? Like becoming a comedian, becoming a podcaster, both of them involve a lot of ups and downs along the way. And it honestly probably takes a lot of, being able to handle, getting kicked down and knocked down on several occasions. And so I kind of want to dig into where some of that grit and resolve comes from. I mean, is it one of those things where you've just learned to laugh at yourself and pick up the pieces and go?
I don't know, dude. I really don't know, because it's funny. I don't like the sound of what you just said, but like clearly I gravitate towards it in some capacity for whatever reason. Like I don't like the idea of like a competitive, cutthroat, difficult existence. Yet here I am. You know what I mean? And a lot of the time, there's a lot of comedians who are like athletes, and there's some parallel that people draw to that as far as like the competitive whatever goes. I personally don't love direct competition that much. I don't like the pressure of like competing in something where I can like be declared the loser. You know what I mean? So maybe that's why I like comedy, because in tennis, like, and again, like my girlfriend, now fiance, always says that I like don't talk about the fact that I was such a competitive tennis player enough or whatever, or that it's weird that I don't. Maybe it is. I don't know. But in tennis, you play a match, you either win or you lose, and that's it. There's no like in between. And yes, granted, maybe on a certain day you might be able to beat somebody. It's like it's not always clear like who's better than someone else. It might just be like who won that day type of thing. Comedy is like not really like that. It's hard to sort of pinpoint a winner and a loser because it is subjective to a degree. So like one person might not find you funny at all, but you might be very, very popular still, or one specific group of people might find you very funny and other people might not. So it's like hard to measure. And also like you don't have a shelf life either, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
The way that you do in sports, where like, when you're 35, it's really hard to compete at the highest level in competitive sports. With comedy or with whatever, like the stuff that I'm doing now, it doesn't seem like age is going to be a factor until, I get super fucking old or have some debilitating condition. But you know what I mean? So maybe that, like, if we're doing a deep dive into the stuff, that could have something to do with it. But it is an interesting thing to explore for sure, dude.
Yeah. I mean, like, when I think about it, maybe you can kind of fill us in, right? Like, was there a roadmap when you started dipping your toe into the field, right? Or how much of it was figure it out as you go along?
That's a great question, dude. That's a great question. It's easy, that's specific. I like that because you're a guy.
I went from one question you didn't like to another that you're like.
No. I liked it. I liked the question. I didn't like the sound of what you were describing, but it was a great question. And I didn't want you to think I was critiquing your interviewing style.
He's like the nicest guy. I've seen him do this on his podcast too, where like he wants to make sure no one's offended. Trust me, it'll take a lot to offend me here.
I just don't want you to feel bad. But no, it's true because, and I know that you told me a little bit about your background before we got on the show, and my fiance too has a bit of a traditional background. And the thing that's nice about a quote traditional background, if we're going to just put it all in a category, is that a lot of the time there's like there's a few paths that are pretty obvious in different professions. So it's like, okay, you can do this job, which then would lead to this. And then once you're there, someone will hit you up about jobs to do this, and that'll make sense with your career. And if it doesn't work out, if you get laid off, you have severance, you have time, you have this, you have that, you have all these things. So there's like paths. And to your point, like with comedy, that doesn't really exist. And I would say when I started too, it was sort of like right before podcasts became pervasive, especially the comedy podcasts. So like there wasn't any behind the scenes sort of like vehicles to like understand the way that things work to a degree. Even knowing some of that stuff, it's still hard to just be like, okay, I know what to do now. Because the advice that you would give a comedian is pretty straightforward and simple, but it's broad enough that it's hard to specifically act on it, if that makes sense. So when I started, I had absolutely no idea. I had never met another comedian. I knew nothing about comedy. And that may have been a bit of a blessing because I spent 2 years pursuing comedy in a sort of not an untraditional way, but maybe a way that wasn't like the legit way to be doing it. If you were in the know, you wouldn't have done it the way that I did it. But whatever. And I can get more specific about that. But
yeah, get into it. Yeah.
So like basically I was doing these things called bringer shows, which is like you sign up and then your friends pay and come and then you get to go on stage. So there's different kinds. So I was doing ones where you had to get 15 people to come. And those are sort of like the low hanging fruit ones where like you look back 10 years later and the person who ran that show, you're like, that guy was a fucker. You know what I mean? Like that guy was taking advantage of people. So as I was doing it, I found this one that was doing sort of like you only had to bring 3 or 4 people and you would get to perform for some sort of industry person. So I was like, oh, sounds like there's value there. As a kid, my mom used to sign me up for theater. And a lot of the time I'd end up being like the lead part in the thing. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't matter because it's like a small community theater, but like everyone always thought that I had potential in that capacity. Now, it easily could have been the sort of like hot guy from Oklahoma who everyone tells him he should move to LA and then gets there and has no fucking talent and he's not even good looking. Like it may have been something like that. And I don't mean in the looks way. I mean in like the talent way. Like who's to say whether or not I had potential, right? And the more I do this, the more I realize that potential doesn't even matter that much. It's more about sort of like grit and survival skills and like being able to show up and be present and be energetic. So whatever. But I would do these industry shows and you'd meet a variety of people. At the time, I didn't really understand the value of who versus who. Like you'd meet some road bookers and they can't really do much for you because you're a new comic. You maybe have 7 minutes of material. You have no credits. At the time, there was no like grassroots. I have a big following, therefore I have an audience. It was like, there was actually a more clear path to success in that if you were able to somehow get on the late show, if you were able to get a half-hour special, you then got to go on the road. But now it's a little less clear. Now it's more about like followers than that. You can sell tickets based on your following. Anyway, so I would do these industry shows and I'd meet road bookers. I'd meet talent agents and managers. Now they were like pretty low level talent agents and managers, but they would still submit you for stuff and they could get you some auditions, especially for like commercials. So I started doing some commercials and actually started getting some. I started getting a couple like non-union commercials. One of them was actually a pretty big campaign. It's this like global Sony campaign. That was like a huge thing for me, whatever. Did that. I got cast on an MTV show from it too, because somebody hit up the guy who ran the program. Whatever. So I was doing that for a couple of years. And a lot of the time, nothing comes out of those programs, but like I'm a story of a person who actually benefited from it. People kind of rag on it. You know what I mean? So from there, then I started getting looks into actual comedy clubs, getting booked, getting put on shows, developmental spots, blah, 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 blah. And then just putting in a ton of time. And over time, like it growing to a place where now I'm getting booked, whatever. It kind of happens gradually, but sort of about being around a lot is sort of the key thing.
Is it one of those things where, it's kind of like first time you're on stage, are you nervous every time you go on stage, or right now is it routine?
Now it's routine, unless it's like for some reason there's like an added thing that makes it nerve-wracking, whether it's like worrying that I'm gonna sell as many tickets as I promised that I would, or if there's somebody important watching me, or if there's friends who've never come to see me, or like, that kind of stuff will add to it, or like a bigger show, you know what I mean? But like place that I'm used to going, I'm not really nervous at all. No. And when I started, a little bit more so, but very quickly sort of became comfortable in the settings I was doing regularly. And anytime I stepped up to a new thing, it would be nerve-wracking. Like stepping up from being for the feature act to being the headlining act is a very stressful jump.
Got it. Are there any comedians out there that you particularly look up to right now?
Yeah. There's and for like differing sort of reasons. I would say that like Andrew Schultz is a person who I look up to, specifically just like the way that he carries himself, the way that he's able to sort of like be accessible without being weak. I think that's like an impressive thing, an impressive quality that's not easy to accomplish. I think like he works really hard. He's always sort of like thinking of ways to do things differently. And he's like a pioneer with formatting and all that stuff. And I have always respected him, and I've known him forever. And he continues to impress me at every hurdle. So that's the person who comes to mind.
Got it. I'm glad we got that background, because where I want to take this now is I want to move us into the birth of Oops. And then eventually I want to also talk about all the traveling that you've been doing and talking about, your mindset around that. Because, as I mentioned in the bio, you've been to Iraq, you've been to Afghanistan, two places that, the majority of people, within our generation locally probably would never, think to go visit. And so, we have a little bit of background now into Giulio, the comedian, how he got his roots started. Let's progress a little bit into the birth of Oops. Where did that come from?
It was pretty, just a kind of a classic. And this is part of why, like, being omnipresent when you're beginning your comedy career is maybe the most important thing that you can do, because a lot of opportunities are birthed from connections. And the only way to make those connections in comedy is by being around the scene, whether you're performing or around the shows. Like, you want people to know who you are, and you want people to like and respect you. So that is just an unbelievably time-consuming endeavor to be able to do that over time, because you can't just show up and make a splash, because nobody wants to fuck with you and give you like insight on how to do it. It was hard for everybody, so nobody wants to make it easy for anybody. They don't want there to be shortcuts. So it takes years of being around for people to actually take you seriously. And there's still people who started before me who still don't take me seriously. You know what I mean? So Oops came because Francis had his whole thing. He got fired from his job for writing some article that got him in trouble. He wanted to start a podcast. Him and I had been bumping into each other a bunch. We weren't like good friends, but like we were friendly, and he has good social skills. Like he's an easy guy to sort of like chit chat with if you bump into him. And he sort of thought that it might be a good idea to try to do a pod together. He would always kind of say that he thought that I was like a well-liked guy, which was nice of him to say. Thought that would sort of like counterbalance his apparently controversial impulses or instincts. I don't know if he's just being sweet when he says that, but I think there was some degree maybe of truth to it. And I think that people liked our sort of rapport and our banter together back and forth. He was a little more cynical. I was a little more optimistic. We would kind of go at it a little bit, and we just became really good friends over the years. So that's sort of how that came to be. I was lucky that he sort of had a big eye. He had a big sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like an eyeglass on him going into starting the pod. So we immediately had a bunch of eyeballs. We had a lot of drop off, and then we kind of like built it back up. And it was just a really great, steady, solid thing for many years. And it still is, you know, I mean, we're in a little bit of a rebuilding phase, but I would have never thought to start a podcast. And now I can't imagine a world where I didn't have one.
That's awesome. And for context for the listeners, Giulio is referring to Francis Ellis from Barstool, who was his co-host. And, you know, obviously some changes happened over the last couple of months. And, you know, as a listener on the outside, one of the things that I listened in on in particular, and as a podcaster myself, was how you navigated that transition, you know, without sharing details that you probably can't share. I'm sure that was a difficult transition for you. But one of the things that really stood out about it for me throughout that was you were authentic and vulnerable throughout about, hey, like, we're going to be okay. We're going to keep this thing going. We're going to push it through. You know, you had talked about your sponsors. You had talked about, you know, the push to your audience to say, hey, just work with us for a little bit. We're going to keep pushing through. And, you know, I've been listening since. And, you know, it's a testimony to your investment in making the best product possible for your fans and for the audience that you've built. I want to take maybe a 30,000 foot view just to kind of give the audience some takeaways from this experience. And if you want to pull back and say, hey, like, we've actually been through worse shit, like that actually wasn't even, you know, the worst thing that we've seen, that's fine. But I want the audience to kind of dig into the mindset around, you know, you had a really good partnership that essentially had to go in a different direction, and then you had to figure it out, but you kept your head up. Why don't you walk us through some of that?
Yeah, well, I now needed to figure out what I was going to do. The pod, you know, was left with me, and as it should have been. I think, you know, it would have been ridiculous to have it be like, I'm not going to do it anymore, but you also can. You know what I mean? He's like, all right, whatever. So I had to figure out what to do. So we didn't have much time because they kind of told us last second. So I needed to figure out a lot of stuff. What are we going to do with the name? Are we going to keep the brand the same? Are we going to keep the same name and just sort of like change the logo? Are we going to have it be solo? Are there going to be guests? Are we going to get Ryan to get more involved, who was like our producer at the time, who sort of like showed some potential for having chops to do the pod? There was just like a bajillion things to do. Plus the fact that now we need to introduce a completely new revenue stream. And the way that it works with a lot of this stuff for podcasting, you don't get paid for 3-4 months. So how are we going to mitigate the damage in the meantime while we're setting everything up? So I'm not just like coming out of pocket from a thing that I used to be making a good amount of money off. You know what I mean? So it was like, I have 1 month to figure this out. So I kind of went into survival mode and just like got on top of it immediately and spent all my time trying to set it up. I had a list, I was calling people, I was grinding, I set everything up, did a big merch drop, made some money. And then at that point, once things were sort of provisionally set up, when the sort of like the reality of the situation set in, that we weren't going to be doing the same thing anymore, which is just like such a bummer, dude. I was like, oh, this sucks. Like, and you know, there's differing feelings during all that, like being mad, being sad, being whatever. And then sort of seeing the comments as you're making the transition when you're in like your toughest time and like you're trying to figure it out, and people are just like not cutting you slack and just like kicking you while you're down. And you know, it was like a little bit of, it was hard to just like, you know, accept the fact that like I was now inheriting this like really difficult transition. I'm proud of where we are now. I really like the idea of building the brand out on my own and not having to, and just having the flexibility of being the key decision maker. You know, it's a really dynamic lifestyle that we live. We're on the road all the time. We're doing all this shit. And it was hard to coordinate all that. And I like to think that I generally have like a pretty positive attitude, and I think Ryan does too. And it's been all good vibes, and we've just been working hard and trying shit and hoping that it works. And as long as the pod is able to support itself and make us a little bit of money, like we're going to keep doing it forever. And if one day it were to not be able to, I'd have to reassess the situation. But for now, I feel pretty confident about the future of it.
Appreciate that. And look, from the outside world, like, again, as a listener, I want to applaud you for the grace that you kind of employed throughout that period, because as a creator, I understood what you were going through. I didn't have a partner or a co-host. So, that part of it, I can understand that you were going through a grief cycle of sorts and trying to pick the pieces of it. But I do understand what it means to be now running the platform individually and to be responsible for all that. And how when you're used to continuity and stability and, there's no promises in this world of podcasting. And so, I was really able to empathize with that. I want to give the audience just a little bit of background here. Approximately how many years and episodes were you in when that happened? Just so they know, like, hey, like you guys were doing this for X amount of time.
Almost 4 years, I think.
Yeah. So it was about 4 years. And then all of a sudden, he had to make a shift with regards to the trajectory of the show.
We had to make a shift.
Yeah, you had to make a shift.
You're talking about me. Okay.
Collectively, yeah.
Yeah. So, and the decision Francis had to make was kind of an impossible one. You know what I mean? It's like give up his like, realistically, I would say his I don't want to say ideal job, but a really great job for him. I think it's a good fit for him. And I think he was doing well doing it. Like, it would have been crazy for him to just walk away with that to continue doing the pod independently. You know what I mean? There's more to it than that, of course, but like, I never could fault that decision-making process. I was like, I totally get it. You know what I mean? All in all, like, it just was what it was, and I had to like figure it out. So,
yeah. I appreciate you sharing that thought process with everybody, because I think it's really insightful, because maybe people can't relate to that specific circumstance, but there are a lot of times where we go through different kinds of quote unquote breakups, and there are different times where we have to think about how to handle the different emotions all hitting us at once, and trying to figure out a way to come out of it as gracefully as possible. And
dude.
Awesome. And I love even watching Ryan's role kind of change over the last couple of months, in particular. And I see him, becoming a louder and louder voice on the show as, the episodes progress. And I also see a little bit of a mentor-mentee relationship blossoming, as he talks about hitting the stage now himself. And so why don't you talk about that a little bit and your dynamic between the two of you? We won't talk about this for too long because I do want to move on, but just kind of giving the audience around that dynamic and how that kind of picked up after Francis was no longer on the show.
Yeah. So Ryan he's the producer. I kind of like thought about trying to just do like a straight up solo pod where I just like lecture basically. And it just didn't feel right for me, to be honest. And I've seen sort of some of comics who have solo pods use their producer as sort of like a person to talk to. And I liked that. So I was like, okay, let's experiment with that a little bit. And the more I thought about it, like Ryan gave up his kind of traditional career to come over and work for us. And it seems as if he developed his sense of humor while sort of like working on our pod. So it seemed like his now comedic lens fit in well with the values of the podcast. You know what I mean? He's like quirky. He sort of has an old soul. He like likes what he likes. And he's funny, you know what I mean? So I thought that there was a good opportunity to incorporate him and hear what he has to say. And I think he's done great. Also, the like starting out in comedy thing is kind of like unique. And I think that's like a little fun side story to explore. Like you said, the mentor-mentee thing, I think it's unique in a capacity. So I like that. And I just like the idea of having like an ensemble cast of people who are like regulars and like bringing them on and shooting the shit and whatever. And just trying to like keep a rapport and like the same vibe from before. It's like there's a conversation happening that you feel like maybe you can participate in. the audience means a lot to me. You know what I mean? So I'm just trying my best to keep it compelling and try new things and make a good show, you know?
Love it. Love it. Yeah. No, Ryan's low key. Like he's hilarious up front, but he's also like subtly, like he'll throw something in that'll just make you like burst out laughing. He's like
great.
the perfect complement sometimes to a lot of the info that you throw out on the show. Last question I have about Oops, and not really a question, but you've done a lot over the years, right? You've had a lot of really good experiences on the show over the years. Anything in particular stand out? Any moment that you're like kind of look back on with like, oh man, like that was awesome, whether it was a guest or a story or whatever it went down?
Yeah, there's so many of those. And the thing that was so great about this, and I was trying to explain this to my fiance the other day, when she was talking to me about like formatting the future of the podcast and figuring out what works and whatever. And I really just think that the thing that I realized about participating in this podcast is that as the person podcasting, you get to dictate the world of the podcast. And I think it only makes sense for a comedian to have that showcase be the perspective and the point of view of the comedian. So it's like, theoretically, I believe that whatever it is I have to talk about or that I want to talk about is compelling enough to talk about. And it doesn't have to be much more complicated than that. You know what I mean? So that's what the pod was built on to begin with. And I think that that's what we're going to try to just continue to tap in on going forward. Obviously, sort of like gauging what works and what doesn't work or whatever type of thing. But it's a comedy podcast. It's comedians saying shit they think is funny. And as far as one moment that sticks out, there was the PlayStation 3 clip. I don't know if you ever saw that one. It was an old clip. I waited in line to buy a PlayStation overnight when I was in college. A guy paid me for my spot in line. And then when he made me come in the store with him, and then he sort of suggested that he thought that he had paid too much and was also further suggesting that there might have to be something done about that. And I had seen a bunch of shit happen. I don't know if I was being paranoid. He denies it, which was where I'm getting at with the story. But I told that whole story and I described the guy, and somehow he saw the clip. And it was definitely him because he had a very specific tattoo on his neck. And I said his name, which I probably shouldn't have done. And anyway, he DM'd me.
Oh my God.
I was like, and it was sort of like language where I couldn't tell if he was like threatening me or joking. And he was joking. And now he's like, I don't know if he's different than he was before, but he's like a jujitsu master and he's all like grounded and calm. And he may even be religious. He used to be a music artist. I don't know if he was actually trying to pull some shit with me or not now. But it's just crazy that 10 years after that happened, he was able to find that clip and message me. Not only is that hilarious, but it also showed me like it was the first thing that I had ever done that truly had reach, that I truly had a fan base for. It's been the number one most useful tool to get people in seats at my shows on the road, by far, more than any other thing I've ever done combined. And it just shows the power of connecting with an audience in that capacity and being yourself, and what people are willing to do for you and and that they'll spend their money for you and come spend time with you, you know?
That's amazing, man. In the spirit of connecting with people, connecting with others, one of the themes that comes up on your show a lot, and one of the things that you talk about a lot, is your passion for travel and why you think it's a critical part of who you are. And I know we said we come back to this and some of the areas that you've traveled to, but let's just first at the surface level talk about your philosophy around travel and going to different places around the world.
Yeah, thanks. Dude, yeah, I think it seems like you have a good understanding of what I'm all about or whatever. But traveling is an important part of my identity, my work, my sort of whatever. And my personal and my professional life are pretty intertwined. You know what I mean? It's like I've tried to figure out a way to make my passions my job and not beyond performing comedy, like just my interests in general. So I believe that travel is a very important thing. I know that that's a cliche, but I truly believe that you can learn so much from other people, even in places where you think that place isn't as good as where you live, if you're from the West. And you might be right about that. You might not be. It might be a perspective thing. But everywhere that I go, even in America, I'm always shocked to learn the way that people do things and to take little pieces of it and to learn from it and to make myself a better and more well-rounded person. And also to just like remind myself not to be convinced of what I think about a thing or a group of people. Because if you're not around things or people, it's amazing how quickly you decide the reality of the situation, when most of the time you will be very far off, or at the very least not giving these things the nuance that they deserve. So I've always been curious about that. I've been curious about perception of danger, perception of what people and places are like. And I have made a point to try to see the entire world methodically over time. And it's sort of like my life's mission to see the as much of the earth as possible. I think by visiting countries is a good place to start. It's sort of like a tangible, easy way to measure it all. And if I am able to accomplish that, then I'll get more specific. That and national parks. I love America.
Yeah,
so those are my two like big passions, is trying to go to all the national park registered sites. It's a good way to just sort of like see every inch of America. And same shit with America, dude. It's such a big, complicated country. And I think if we all spend more time together, we might be able to agree on more stuff as far as like legislation and whatever goes. So
I love it. There's so many directions I want to take this, but I guess let me ask Hillary, is she on board with all the travel?
No, she always jokes that she just doesn't have a choice. She doesn't have a say in the matter, which she's right about. She doesn't want to attempt to clip my wings in any capacity. She wants me to be who I am. So she's not as adventurous as I am, although she has become much more adventurous since we have been together, where she has said to me that her values as far as travel go have shifted, and that I always like to try to go somewhere new when we travel. And before, her impulse was to kind of just go back to the same places always. So whenever we go on trips, we always incorporate new destinations. And I've gotten her to places that none of her friends have been to, and that she probably never would have gone to if she were to have never met me. So that's pretty fun. As far as these like scary places go, it's a process. It's like I introduce it and I try to make her okay with it. And I've had to make myself okay with it. A lot of the time I push myself out of my comfort zone because I have successfully completed the exercise so many times, where I'm like, I know that this is not as scary as I think. Yeah. And I try to just gather as much information as I can to make an informed decision that takes emotion out of it, because I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it to go to these places and see them and try to document it, try to just like show people the world and show the people that people aren't that bad. You know what I mean? Again, another cliche, but I do believe it.
Have you been to Egypt?
No. Are you Egyptian?
I'm Egyptian, so we'll have to get you there at some point.
Sweet. Yeah, I'm very curious about it for sure. I intend to
What was Afghanistan the most impactful trip that you've been on?
I guess, but it's each stage of impactfulness carry their own weight, like as far as your journey to discovery or whatever. So each time I've gone on one of these sort of trips, it's been equally impactful in its own way. The first big one I can talk about is like Rwanda, which now, being an experienced traveler, I realized that Rwanda is like obviously an easy place to go to. But at the time I was sort of like in the same boat of everyone else, being like, oh, Rwanda, like genocide, like what the fuck, Africa, you know what I mean? And just being open to getting an update on that and seeing what the deal was, like going there and experiencing urban, quote, upscale life, upwardly mobile life in Rwanda, just like made me realize that things are just not always specifically what they seem. Like not all of Africa is poverty and disease, and you know what I mean? So that was the first one there. Then I went to Iraq, and the same thing with Iraq, where like, again, nothing like I expected at all. I was like, oh my God, like what are people so afraid of? Afghanistan was a little more true to form, but was still impactful in its own right. Like it was very much not what you expect at all. And I outlined this in the piece, but like, it also very much is in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? It was definitely more of an Icarus moment. I had like some scares, which I've talked about pretty in depth. But it was also incredible to kind of like take on a charitable endeavor, you know, having never done that before. And I'm still spending a lot of time sending money and making sure that like the schools that we set up are well oiled. For anybody who isn't familiar with it, we started some schools over in Afghanistan kind of by chance because we could. And so overall, maybe it's the most impactful because other people are directly involved as far as like receiving aid. But it's been fun to have those impactful moments all along. And I hope that this stays as interesting to me at once I sort of like drain the world of all the impactful destinations. I like to think that everywhere I go will be impactful in some way. And hopefully I don't lose the thirst for it.
I love that. Just so the audience knows, can you give just some information high level around the piece that you put together in Afghanistan, where they could find it and what the purpose of it was?
Sure. Yeah. It's called Places You Can Go, Afghanistan. It's on the Oops YouTube channel. If you search Places You Can Go, Afghanistan, it'll come up. It's 5 episodes, 1 through 4. And there's an episode 3.5, which my video guy said is confusing. He's right. But it felt like a proper classification. But basically, it's just the second part of the series. The first one was Iraq, just showing you what places that you think you can't go to are like. Now, calling it Places You Can Go is a bit tongue in cheek because like, I don't think that I'd recommend a trip there for somebody who wasn't that experienced at traveling. Iraq is a different story. I think that's like very doable trip for pretty much anyone. Afghanistan, not so much, but I just wanted to sort of show a lighter side of a place that doesn't seem to have it. And it's been controversial a little bit. Like people are giving more sort of like feedback across the spectrum. Like people have gotten angry about it. People are happy about it, whatever. But I wanted to just give an identity to like the, 90 whatever percent of people in Afghanistan who are just living normal ass fucking lives, the nicest people on the planet, who just happen to have been born in a place that has been tumultuous and stressful and dangerous. You know what I mean? So that was sort of the purpose. And just then you'll see what ended up transpiring.
Awesome. Awesome. So, my last question for you is around the interjection of being a comedian in these landscapes, right? Like you're going in with a different mentality than just a regular tourist. I think maybe I'm being a little presumptuous here, but something tells me that if you're a comedian by trade, right, and you are looking for experiences and subconsciously or consciously, whatever it may be, you're probably always looking for material or mindful of material around you, and experiences that you probably look at from a different lens given what you do. But there's another side of this where because you are a comedian, I find you to be very lighthearted and simple and approachable. And, you can laugh at tough situations, not in a negative way, but like if they're being directed at you, you can laugh at yourself. And I think that's, a positive projection to other people, and one that makes you, number one, hospitable, but also approachable. And so I kind of want to close things off by talking about how you've interacted in these new arenas and your mindset as a comedian and how the two have played together, and how you've maybe interacted with the locals or how you've got yourself to really dive into these cultures.
Totally. Okay. So it's interesting because a lot of the time there have been times where people have sort of, I don't want to say, no one's necessarily ever actually said this, but I know that there's a school of thought that thinks that like, you can't treat people in these places the way that you treat people in your own place that you live. And I think that is inherently like condescending and hypocritical in this way. Cause it's like, oh, you need to be sensitive about whatever, but then you're like dehumanizing them by doing that. You're acting like they're lesser people or like they're not people at all. So I try to maintain that it's important to treat these people like normal people. Like if somebody is being a dick, I can say that this guy's being a dick. It's not like just because, oh, but he's poor and he's like, I don't think like you need to like try to treat people eye to eye. And the best like comedy scenarios come from that. So I have no problem busting people's balls. If somebody does something funny, there's no reason why I can't be like, that guy's funny. That's funny. I don't like pick on people. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I don't see any reason why I can't go there and be in a good mood. I can't go there and I don't have to be like, oh, here it's like, I'm sensitive about the fact that these people's lives are terrible. Like that all may be true. Whether or not their lives are terrible isn't necessarily for me to specifically judge, by the way. But I don't see any reason why I can't go in there and be funny and joke about funny stuff. And then if I'm talking about stuff that's a little more serious, I can do that too. And I thought that it was a challenge to do that properly in the piece, but I think that we really were successful in being able to joke around, make friends, be funny, make fun of things that deserve to be made fun of, you know what I mean, in the country, and then sort of highlight things that deserve to be praised in the country. And that doesn't make this some sort of like Taliban propaganda piece. Not sitting there talking about the Taliban. And so I think that like being a comedian plays into all of that. Like comedians are more likely to be in touch with like their actual voice in a performative state. So like one of the keys to being a good comedian is I want to sound the way I sound right now talking to you while I'm doing my material. That's a difficult thing for people to be able to learn, right? So that's like a step. So when you're hosting a show, it's sort of the same thing. And that's why I think comedians tend to be good hosts a lot of the time because they're able to be in touch with that. So I think that all plays into it. One thing that I want to add that I think is sort of interesting is it was a challenge to make a video where I talk about the Taliban, where I'm not so critical of them that I put the subjects of my video in danger in some way, but where I'm also not being pro-Taliban, which I am obviously anti-Taliban, if that isn't obvious. But it was interesting to be able to be subtle enough to make a thing that was completely objective about the Taliban, where it's like, obviously, if you were just reading this information and taking it at face value, you're like, oh, that's bad. You know what I mean? Without adding sort of like specific emotive words that show my bias. You know what I mean? So that it could kind of like slide under the radar. So that was a very challenging thing about that video. And I think we did a good job. So I just wanted to add that on top. But, I love this shit, dude. I'm trying to figure out my next one now. I'm editing a Nicaragua piece that I made. My buddy Josh is doing it for me for free, which he's a fucking saint for doing that. And onward and upward, man. It's a constant battle. You're always competing against other people who are doing more than you and trying to get the attention of the people who you work with and people who are going to give you opportunities, but it's all part of it and it's fun and going to keep going.
Spot on, my man. Really appreciate you coming on the show. Appreciate you responding, letting me slide in the DMs and just kind of making this happen really quickly. Everybody listening, check out Oops. Check out the Afghanistan special on YouTube. Honestly, like I said from the beginning, and you pointed it out in your last answer there is, you keep the conversation the same regardless of who you're talking to. And, I might be rambling at this point. One of the things that stands out about you as a podcaster that I really enjoy is honestly even just listening you do your ad reels. When you talk about ads on your show, I feel like I'm listening to a friend. I'm not listening to an advertiser. And so you're the companies that sponsor you are lucky to have you.
That's very nice. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So I just want to say thanks, man. I appreciate you. It's been great having you on the show today.
Yeah, dude, it was my pleasure. I appreciate it. And just notjulio.com for tickets and all my links and stuff and socials. And dude, thanks a lot for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
You got it, brother.